Trump has just announced a trade deal with the EU. The USA, of course, is the largest economy in the world, and depending on how you measure it, the EU is either the second largest in nominal terms or the third largest behind China if you do it on purchasing power parity terms. Whatever the specifics, this trade deal is a big deal. But what's bigger than the deal itself is what both the US and the EU are going to have to do in order to deliver on their respective promises under this deal. Buckle up, because we're going to go step by step through some of the key promises in this announcement and talk about what they actually mean in practice. Let's go.
So we're going to do the following. The European Union is going to agree to purchase from the United States $750 billion worth of energy. $750 billion worth of energy.
Stop right there. I said that the significance of this deal is not the deal itself, but what each country will have to do in order to comply with the deal. In order for the EU to buy $750 billion in energy from the USA, over time of course, well, the USA have to have $750 billion worth of energy to sell. And not in the form of electrons in batteries, but in the form of coal and gas and oil, things that can be transported from one continent to another. This is further confirmation that Trump is dead serious about making the USA an energy superpower with his drill baby drill policy. But also, that would mean that the EU will import from the USA nearly 3 times the energy that it currently imports from Russia. Which, to be fair, still isn't quite as much as what they used to import from Russia before the Ukraine war started, but it still shifts the geopolitical focus for energy security of the EU away from Russia and onto the USA. This is not just a trade deal, this is a geopolitical realignment. Now, before we continue, my name is Topher Field, this is the Topher Project, and I work flat out bringing stories and analysis like this to Australian audiences. Now, if you appreciate what I do here and you'd like to help me to keep the Topher Project going, then please buy me a coffee via the button at topherfield.net, and if you find my videos insightful or thought-provoking, then you really should check out my books, my DVD, and all my merch at goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. Thank you for all the love and support. I'm closing in on 100,000 YouTube subscribers too, so please hit that subscribe button and help me to get there that little tiny bit sooner. Now, back to this trade deal.
They are going to agree to invest into the United States $600 billion more than they're investing already. So they're investing a large amount of money. You know what that amount of money is. It's very substantial, but they're going to invest an additional $600 billion.
Investment from the EU into the US is interesting, and it puts the lie to this idea that Trump is some sort of an isolationist or he's trying to cut the US off from the global economy. He's not. But there is a catch here, a caveat, because a lot of that money, that investment, is probably for EU manufacturers and producers to start producing on US soil for the purpose of avoiding the 15% import tariffs that they are going to have if they export goods out of the EU into the US. More on that tariff in a minute. But as far as Trump is concerned, this is still a win. Now, I see it differently. I'm a libertarian. I'm not a fan of any kind of barriers to trade at all, but that's not the point right now. The point is that from the EU's perspective, it was kind of a muchness. They could spend the money to set up operations in the US and avoid the tariffs, or they could spend the money on the tariffs. Meh. Trump had put them in a situation where no matter what they did, it was a win for him, or at the very least, it was something that he could portray as being a win for him. So chalk up another one to Trump.
They're agreeing to open up their countries to trade at zero tariff. So that's a very big factor. Opening up their countries, all of the countries will be opened up to trade with the United States.
Okay. So this sounds massive, and it is, to be fair, but it does require a little bit of explanation and history because there's a fair bit going on here in that very simple statement. First, it is only 0% tariffs for US going into the EU. Anything coming the other way is taxed at 15% from the EU into the US. Now, why would the EU agree to such a lopsided deal? Well, because if you've been watching my work for a while, you'll be aware that this is not actually a lopsided deal. Trump is using tariffs to make up for the EU's unbalanced non-tariff barriers and industry subsidies, which the EU are not going to get rid of. If you cast your mind back to one of my earlier videos, you'll remember that this is not the first time that the EU has struck a free trade deal with the US and with Trump. In fact, Jean-Claude Juncker struck an actual free trade deal, somewhat accidentally and almost against his will, with the US almost exactly 7 years ago. Now, after he had a meeting with Donald Trump in the Rose Garden at the White House, he went back to the EU and, in their press release, the European Commission stated that they had agreed to work towards zero tariffs, zero non-tariff barriers, and zero subsidies on non-auto industrial goods. Spoiler alert, they did not, in fact, get anywhere near zero tariffs, zero non-tariff barriers, and zero subsidies on anything. I covered this some time ago in some detail in episode 53 of the Topher Project. You're welcome to go back and watch that. Now, that meeting happened back in 2018, and Trump had been threatening tariffs on steel, aluminium, energy, cars, and a bunch of other stuff. Sound familiar? Trump was playing the EU like a fiddle, and Jean-Claude Juncker came over to visit Trump, cap in hand, extolling to Trump the virtues of free trade and the need to not have tariffs. That's when Trump flipped the script and offered Jean-Claude Juncker and the EU absolute free trade. No tariffs, no non-tariff barriers, nothing in either direction. The only condition was that it had to be reciprocal. And Juncker, well, he didn't expect that offer, but he went back to the EU with that deal in hand. It was announced, as you just saw in that press release, and then it never happened. Why? Well, because the EU can't survive internally without its industrial subsidies and its quotas. You've got to understand, the EU is essentially a socialist economy. It is a borderline replacement for the USSR, economically speaking, centrally planned via quotas, price controls, subsidies, and more. And to get that free trade deal with Trump, to be able to do that external free trade would have meant doing away with all of their internal control. And they just couldn't bring themselves to do it. See, the EU commissioners themselves, they would not get re-elected if they abolished all of the industry subsidies and the protection, because the people of Europe like it this way. They like their socialism, their chains. So the deal fell apart, and less than 18 months later, Trump lost at the next presidential election in the United States of America, and the rest is history. But 4 years after that, Trump 2.0 returned to the White House, and he's learned from that experience. He now knows that the EU cannot and will not drop their non-trade barriers. He knows that they're not going to be able to eliminate their industry subsidies. There's no point even asking them to. So what he's done instead is push them into an asymmetrical trade deal, which compensates for their existing non-trade barriers and industry assistance. That's why the US can import into the EU with no tariffs, because the American companies, mostly, don't benefit from any non-tariff assistance or industry protection in the US. The EU, on the other hand, will have a 15% tariff applied to their imports into the US because the EU has these industry advantages of EU-based industry assistance, quotas, price controls, protection, and all the rest. So what Trump has negotiated is essentially, well, it's as close as you can have to a level playing field with the EU. They're never going to eliminate their non-trade barriers and assistance. If they were, they would have already done that when Jean-Claude Juncker made that deal in 2018. So an asymmetrical tariff that compensates for the asymmetrical non-trade barriers is at least somewhat a more level playing field between them. But I promise you that you won't hear that history and perspective from any of the mainstream media. They're all bleating about how it's a one-sided deal and how Ursula von der Leyen has capitulated to Donald Trump. Well, no, it's not actually a one-sided deal, and to be fair, she didn't really capitulate. If there were no tariffs in either direction and no non-tariff barriers in either direction, that would be free and fair trade. But if there were no tariffs in either direction and yet the non-tariff barriers in favour of the EU remained in place, it would be a one-sided deal in the EU's favour. So these lopsided tariffs are, believe it or not, actually just balancing that playing field. Okay, moving on.
And they're agreeing to purchase a vast amount of military equipment. We don't know what that number is, but it's the good news is we make the best military equipment in the world, so sort of you have to do that. I mean, until somebody tops us, which is not going to happen. We're way ahead of every other country in terms of the quality of the military equipment. You saw that recently in Iran, and you see that, unfortunately, you see that often for all the wrong reasons, right?
Trump is actually being a little bit mean here because various EU countries do build some fantastic military hardware, but not at the very top end of technology and scale. Things like aircraft carriers, intercontinental ballistic missile nuclear submarines, stealth bombers, all that sort of stuff. That is a bit of a uniquely American thing, only they really have the top end technology and budget to do it. But also, that's not the stuff they're going to sell to the EU. None of that is for sale. The kinds of things that the US would actually be willing to sell to the militaries of the EU are also the kinds of things that the EU can mostly produce for itself pretty well. Except that, as Trump goes on to say a little later in the press conference,
then we're going to get along great. And we have a great relationship now with NATO, which is largely the same. I mean, not exactly, but pretty close, right? Largely. And with NATO, as you know, they're going up to 5% from 2%, and the relationship is very strong.
He's referencing the percentage of GDP which NATO countries have agreed to spend on their own self-defense budgets. For a long time, they've been spending less than 2%, some as high as 2.5%, but well under what they were obliged to spend as part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So Trump has pressured them to increase that to 5%. And that's what he's referencing here. And it's that increase that is going to necessitate many NATO countries buying weapons off the USA, because those countries simply don't have the industrial capacity to ramp up their own domestic weapons production to the point that it actually reaches 5% of their GDP. Now, I'm not saying whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying that's what the deal is. The EU is going to be buying a lot of weapons off the US because that's the only way they're going to be able to meet their commitment to increase defense spending to 5% of their GDP. Okay, there is a lot more in this deal, but that's kind of the main stuff that you need to know about, and that's the background to help you understand it. But the headline for me really is that Trump got everything he wanted. And I mean everything. NATO lifting their defense spending to 5%, the EU redirecting their energy dependence away from Russia and Russian allies in the Middle East and towards the US, tariffs against the EU to insulate the US from the EU's subsidized producers, and they're going to get some big weapons orders for their military-industrial complex as well. Again, I'm not saying that's a good thing, I'm just saying Trump won. And Trump, in fact, didn't just win, he crushed it. Because yet again, and I've covered this so many times before, I'm almost a little bit sick of it, yet again, the rest of the world's leaders, the diplomats, don't seem to be able to comprehend or handle a little bit of gamesmanship from Donald Trump. Honestly, it's not that hard to understand what Trump is up to. Just read his book, The Art of the Deal, and then actually listen to what he says. I mean, really listen. And don't try and imagine what he means. Just take him at his word. It is that simple. Let me show you just how under-equipped the EU were in their negotiations by quoting from The Guardian's coverage. According to them, the European Trade Commissioner said Trump was close to walking out of the room. And I'm going to quote from the article. He spoke about the very intense atmosphere in the ballroom at Trump's Scottish golf resort and how European Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen had kept Trump, who had already told reporters that he was in a bad mood, in the room. End quote. Can you believe they fell for that? Negotiation 101. Make the other side believe that you are more willing to walk away than what they are. So you tell the media that you're in a bad mood. You don't want to be there. Convince them before you even begin that you're ready to walk out of that room. Make them believe that you're only just being kept in the room, at the table, and that one wrong move from them will mean that you're gone. This is playground stuff. These are meant to be world leaders, global diplomats, and they're getting sucked in by some of the oldest tricks in the book. The Guardian goes on. Insiders say that he started out insisting that he'd go ahead with a planned 30% tariff on Friday and then demanded 21% before finally settling on 15%. Yeah, so now the EU negotiators can walk out of that room and tell the world that they did a great job, getting him down all the way down from 30% to 15%. But I promise you, 15% was the number that Trump had in mind before that meeting ever started. He started at 30% so that they could negotiate him down to where he always wanted to be in the first place. Honestly, it's not that hard, and I don't understand how world leaders get sucked in like this so easily. But that's the EU trade negotiations pretty much sorted. It's certainly not a free trade deal, but it's about as close as the EU were ever going to get to a free trade deal given their own internal trade barriers and industry protection. And it sets the tone. Trump gets what he wants. I'll await with interest to see what the UK get, because let's not forget that the UK are no longer included in the EU trade negotiations, so they'll have to negotiate in their own right. And as I've said before, and I'll say it again, no one gets a free trade deal with Trump unless they're willing to give their people freedom of speech. And the UK is not giving its people freedom of speech. In fact, they're turning in a very dark direction as we speak. The negotiations for trade between the UK and the US will be a very interesting test of my theory. Will Trump go easy on them because of the history and friendship that those countries have? Or will he go hard on them because of the reality of who the UK is becoming today? Time will tell. For Australia, well, sorry, but Australia is screwed because we don't have free speech in Australia. Our Karen is trying to censor Americans and American tech companies, and our ambassador Kevin Rudd is a man that Trump deeply and rightly despises. Let's hope that any tariffs that are applied to Australia don't apply to lube, because I have a feeling we're going to need quite a lot of it. My name's Topher Field. This is the Topher Project, and I help busy people like you not only to know what's going on, the headlines, but to actually understand what's going on. And you can help me to keep the Topher Project going by buying me a coffee via the button at topherfield.net, and check out my books, DVDs, and merch, including my newly launched long-sleeve t-shirts like this one, all available right now from goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. Thank you for your support and for making it possible for me to keep the Topher Project going. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. The algorithm loves you, and so do I. Please like, subscribe, comment with your thoughts on what sort of free trade deal Australia is likely to get. And as always, think free.